Ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Kirzner, dear friends of the Hayek Society, and if present, any students, welcome to you all. This is the beginning of the Hayek Days, which we have once a year, every summer. We usually have very interesting debates, and we will have a wonderful input tonight. Thanks for coming here. I know it was a little bit difficult to find. I'm glad you made it. And I hope you don't consider it a sign of bad taste that we invited you here to join us in what the Berlin people call the Trichinae Temple. It, of course, was called this way because it was transformed at some stage into a meat inspection, meat hygiene institute. It now serves as an exhibition space, has been renovated rather recently, and it is actually one of the oldest academic buildings here in Berlin, as Charles Beat Blanca just told us. It was built in 1789 by Karl Langhans, and people from the city probably know that Langhans is the person who built the Brandenburg Gate, so he's relatively famous. Dear Professor Kirzner, now to you. It is a great honor to have you here. I'm really grateful for your taking the pain of traveling from the other side of the Atlantic. We cannot thank you enough for having undertaken that tiresome trip. The Friedrich Hayek-Gesellschaft is an academic society that specifically aims to foster research along the lines of Hayek's program, and it tries to help disseminating the insights that are being gained this way. Certainly the most prestigious ones of our activities is the attribution of the Hayek Medal. This annual award is given to exceptional personalities who have made important contributions to a constitution of liberty, be it in economic science, in the media, or in politics. Among our past laureates were Gary Becker in 2003, Vernon Smith in 2008, Victor Vanberg in 2010, where is he? Ha, right. And Jeff Brennan in 2014. And this year I'm very proud to extend the award to Israel Kirzner, who is not only a famous rabbi and Talmud scholar, but also one of the figureheads, if I may say so, of research in Austrian economics. Both his academic contributions and his organizational efforts have been crucial in the revival of this inspiring school of thought. His thorough scholarship, his personal integrity and civility can serve as an example, of course, that is difficult to match. Please allow me a few words on Israel Kirzner's background. While he has spent most of his time, most of his life in the United States, you will hear from his accent, or should I say his lack of accent, that he wasn't born there. He was born in England, in London. This was in 1930. His father was a well-known rabbi and Talmudist. When he was 10 years old, his family moved to South Africa. He began his studies at the University of Cape Town, but then moved to the United States. The entrepreneur, and Kirzner became famous for his interpretation of the entrepreneur, must already have been on his mind during these years of study, as one can infer from the fact that after his undergraduate studies at Brooklyn College, Kirzner moved on to New York University, to NYU, to study business, with a concentration on, you won't believe it, accounting. But NYU changed this path. Kirzner met Ludwig von Mises and got interested in economic science more widely understood. Under the guidance and inspiration from Mises, he wrote his PhD thesis, which he completed in '57. And he stayed on as a professor of economics at NYU, which seems to have become his second home. He never left. And due to his efforts, NYU has flourished like no other university in teaching Austrian economics. His key contribution, as I personally see it, is his explanation of the role and the importance of the entrepreneur, both for economic growth and the functioning of the market. Most people in this room, I guess, are relatively familiar with Austrian economics, but a brief sketch might be helpful for some of the students that I hope are here. Austrian economics is an economic school of thought, that the roots of which go back, as the name says, to Austria. Prominent names such as Karl Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and Friedrich von Mises come to mind, but also in the next generation, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich August von Hayek. Those were the good old days when economists began to understand the meaning and the functioning of the interest rate, when an intertemporal theory of capital came into life, when methodological individualism became a functional and foundational paradigm. The Nazi regime, the Holocaust, and the Second World War disrupted this intellectual tradition, like many others, and important thinkers migrated to the US. And so it came naturally that America has become the locus for the revival of the Austrian school. In the beginning, Mises was crucial. Later, it was Israel Kirzner who was instrumental in laying the foundation for a new research community in Austrian economics and in the theory of the competitive market process, a theory that has also spurred innovation research as such. Austrian economics, let me make this clear, is neither a belief system nor the glue of a sectarian movement. It is a school of thought based on a couple of very convincing paradigms. Its field extends from methodological work to monetary theory, from business cycle theory to innovation research. What holds all these together is the process-oriented approach, that is a dynamic approach that looks at the market process unfolding in real time rather than at its comparative static outcomes. Among its essential features are the paradigm of methodological individualism, as I have already mentioned, which means that all analysis starts from the individual, even when one aims at explaining the larger picture. The recognition that the facts of the social sciences are subjective in nature, and Professor Kirzner will later explain what that really means. The focus on the exchange paradigm instead of choice, which opens up the perspective for repeated voluntary interaction and coordination. The perspective that accounts for the passing of time, of subjective expectations and errors. The understanding that the flexible system of relative prices is essential for social coordination in the marketplace. Hayek called this a marvel. The recognition that capital is heterogeneous, that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, that private property is the precondition for any meaningful economic calculation, and that competition is a discovery procedure. And finally, the insight that many social institutions are the result of human action, not human design, as the famous phrase by the Scottish thinker Adam Ferguson goes. These ingredients, to be sure, aren't meant to be taken for tenets of faith. They constitute neither the Ten Commandments nor the Talmudic principles. These ingredients are scientific tools adopted for their plausibility because they can be philosophically derived in a robust, convincing manner, and for their explanatory power. No more than that, but also no less. Israel Kirzner's contributions on the key role of the entrepreneur is one that is so basic in a way that it may often go unnoticed. It sort of slips under the thick carpet of mainstream economics. It is odd, however, to realize how standard neoclassical economics has survived without having the slightest notion of the entrepreneur and what he or she does. Neoclassical price theories simply states that in perfect competition with all market participants being perfectly rational and disposing of perfect information, as it behooves Homo economicus, of course, markets will clear at equilibrium and no profits will remain. But if no profits remain, why become an entrepreneur in the first place? And why compete? What for? A first answer to this stunningly simple but crucial question was given by Josef Schumpeter, who, not surprisingly, was Austrian. In some respects, he can also be counted as part of the earlier Austrian school, even though he was an iconoclast in every respect. Schumpeter describes the entrepreneur as a specific species of man bubbling with energy and obsessed with ideas, who has found a new combination that he sets out to bring to the market. This can be a proper invention or simply an innovation relevant for producing or distributing some good. In Schumpeter's theory, the entrepreneur disrupts an existing equilibrium, setting free the forces of imitation and rivalry, until at some later stage the economy settles at a new equilibrium. The impulse to this process is given by what he famously and very intuitively called creative destruction. This model, however, isn't fully satisfactory, and this is where Israel Kirzner comes in, building on both Hayek and Mises, and certainly others, and their notions of subjectivism, uncertainty, and dispersed knowledge. Kirzner has filled the gap in traditional price theory without needing the almost pathologically heroic traits of the bold Schumpeterian entrepreneur, and without dismissing neoclassical theory altogether. He built a bridge. In his approach, the entrepreneur is an arbitrageur who is alert, and alertness is a key word here. He is alert to emerging gaps between supply and demand, that is, to unexploited profit opportunities in the market. While the Schumpeterian entrepreneur starts in a situation of equilibrium, the Kirznerian entrepreneur begins his action in a situation of disequilibrium. All this action is carried out under genuine uncertainty, which is more than just calculable risk. Let me quote, "Entrepreneurship in individual action consists in the endeavor to secure greater correspondence between the individual's future as he envisages it and his future as it will in fact unfold." That's what he writes. I need a little bit of water before I can go on. The market is thus depicted as an ongoing, dynamic, never-ending process in which the discovery of opportunities for mutual gains from exchange take place. And it is this process that brings about the marvel of social coordination that Hayek first hinted at. This positive outlook is crucial because unless we have good reasons to expect a systemic tendency toward equilibrium, in the sense of successful coordination of individual plans based on subjective expectations in real time, even if it is never achieved in any static sense, how could we then justify the market? How could we uphold the welfare properties of market processes without resorting to nirvana assumptions of equilibrium economics? Kirzner's model has theoretical as well as practical normative implications here, especially in the sense that for the alert entrepreneurs to be able to do what he describes, institutions must be designed in a proper, that is, encouraging way. With his insistence on adequate institutions and policy, Kirzner also rejoins Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. Israel Kirzner's most important publications probably in this field are Competition and Entrepreneurship, a book he published in 1973, Perception, Opportunity and Profit from 1979, Discovery and the Capitalist Process in 1985, and The Meaning of the Market Process in 1992. He has also made important methodological contributions and has ventured out to a recurrent theme both in academia and in public discourse, the theory of justice. In Discovery, Capitalism, and Distributive Justice in 1989, he offers an economic, not moral, critique of theories of distributive justice, the upshot being that they misperceive the discovery role of entrepreneurs in the market process. He closely follows in Mises's and Hayek's footsteps in stressing specifically that the market process has the function of alerting market participants to opportunities which nobody has expected. To initiate governmental policies to grapple with externalities is, in effect, to pretend knowledge which no one can, in principle, honestly claim to possess. Let me end here. There's much more to say, of course, on your theory, but you can do that much better than I can. I hope I didn't have any errors in describing your past and especially your theory. I did my best. And now I would like to move on and celebrate you. I would like to ask you to please accept the Hayek Medal, Professor Kirzner, given to you in admiration and gratefulness. This is our document, the certificate. I'll read out the document text for you. The board of the Friedrich Hayek-Gesellschaft awards the Friedrich I. Hayek Medal 2015 to Professor Israel M. Kirzner, New York, for his theory of the entrepreneurial market process, by which he has built a bridge between neoclassical and Austrian economics, for having developed Mises' radical subjectivism and Hayek's discovery procedure, all pointing to the importance of liberty. Berlin, June 25th, 2015. And now the floor is entirely yours.
Thank you, Dr. Horn, for your really undeservedly generous introduction. And I would add, I believe you presented this evening the most convincing, lucid, and first-rate description and analysis of what Austrian economics means. I congratulate you on that. It would, of course, at this point be appropriate for me to express how honored and humbled I am to be the recipient of this year's Hayek Medal. And I certainly am most grateful, honored, and humbled by this award. But my mode of expressing these feelings and sentiments will first take the form of a careful exploration of one aspect of Hayek's own vast contributions. I will then, at the end of my talk, be able to explain briefly how it is that aspect of Hayek's work, the one that I will be trying to explore this evening, it is that aspect of Hayek's work which especially generates my own deep appreciation for this great honor which the Hayek Society is according me. The title of my talk is Hayek and the Meaning of Subjectivism. Now, Hayek's students will notice the parallelism between the phrase, the meaning of subjectivism, and the title of one of Hayek's own path-breaking papers, The Meaning of Competition. Indeed, the purpose of my talk this evening is to suggest that this parallelism expresses an important insight, and that is that the difference between two identifiable levels of subjectivism in economic theorizing is the root of the difference between the two different meanings of the term competition, which Hayek's paper identified. Our exposition of this insight will take the form of three distinct claims. First of all, we will argue that what was responsible for the mainstream pre-World War II technical use of the term competition, a use which Hayek vigorously criticized in his paper, was a failure to appreciate the deeper level of subjectivist economic theoretical exploration which Hayek himself was expounding. The second claim will at the same time articulate the following significant observation. As we shall see, Hayek attributed to his mentor, Ludwig Mises, a unique level of subjectivist understanding in economics. It seems no accident, therefore, that we will discover that it is in his The Meaning of Competition paper that Hayek makes it clear that in one respect, at least, despite several significant methodological and substantive disagreements separating them, Mises and Hayek, were in thorough agreement. That is, on the dynamic character of the competitive market process and its basis in subjectivist insight. The third claim will be that the circumstance that Hayek's paper appeared during the 37-48 decade will be of considerable importance. This is because it can be argued that it was in that decade that Hayek and Mises made separate series of contributions that, taken together, constituted a radical deepening of the subjectivism that, ever since Menger, was associated with the Austrian tradition in economic theory. Although not widely noticed at the time, these contributions were in fact decisive advances in this Austrian tradition, advances which comprehensive expositions of the history of Austrian economics must surely take into account. In order to begin to support these claims, let us start with the classic, often cited, yet still remarkable statement made by Hayek, originating in the same 37-48 decade, concerning the role of subjectivism in economic theory. In his Counter-Revolution of Science, published in 1955, but originating in several papers in Economica between 42 and 44, in the chapter entitled The Subjective Character of the Social Sciences, Hayek wrote, "It is probably no exaggeration to say that every important advance in economic theory during the last 100 years was a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism." In a footnote to this remarkable sentence, Hayek adds the following glowing tribute to Mises. This, and by that he's referring to the consistent application of subjectivism, this is a development which has probably been carried out most consistently by Ludwig von Mises, and I believe, Hayek believed, that the most peculiarities of his views, of Mises' views, are due to the fact that in the consistent development of the subjectivist approach, he has for a long time moved ahead of his contemporaries. Clearly, Hayek was not merely beating the drums for a subjectivist approach to economic theory. He was specifically attributing advances in modern economic theory to a more consistent application of subjectivism. Apparently, Hayek identified different levels of consistency in the application of subjectivist insights. He associated deeper levels of subjectivism with the more important advances in the modern economic theory of the subjectivist tradition. A similar perception of different levels of subjectivism appears to explain an otherwise puzzling paragraph written, or at least endorsed, by Mises in 1933. In his 1933 book, Grundprobleme der Nationalökonomie, Mises wrote, "Within modern subjectivist economics, it has become customary to distinguish several schools. We usually speak of the Austrian and the Anglo-American schools and the School of Lausanne. Morgenstern's work has said almost all that is necessary about the fact that these three schools of thought differ only in their mode of expressing the same fundamental idea, and that they are divided more by their terminology and by peculiarities of presentation than by the substance of their teachings. That's the end of the quote. At first glance, this paragraph is startling. Anyone, such as I, who studied under Mises during the 1950s, a mere 2 decades after the above paragraph was written, must know that Mises considered his own economic theory to be on a quite different epistemological and substantive track than the mainstream economics of his time. Clearly, the subjectivism of the various schools of modern subjectivist economics to which Mises was referring was at a decisively different level than the subjectivism which supported Mises' own economics and to which Hayek was referring in the above-cited footnote. Now, we have already stated our hope to show that the difference between the various meanings of subjectivism is at the root of the ambiguities in the meaning of competition. But before we develop this thesis, we must first explore the sense in which subjectivism in economics can be described as either superficial or as at a deeper level. When Hayek stated, or at least implied, that some important advances in economic theory dating from the mid-19th century represented steps in the consistent application of subjectivism, he was, without doubt, thinking, inter alia, of the marginal utility revolution of the 1870s, whereas the classical economists had seen systematic chains of cause and effect in economic affairs as being rooted exclusively in the laws of physics and biology, with virtually no role for the consciously choosing individual participant in the economy. The marginal utility revolutionaries succeeded in steering economic theory onto a track which recognized the importance of the consumer and of his choices in economic explanation. This was certainly a crucial advance in economic theory, and it was certainly a significant manifestation of awareness of the role of subjectivist analysis. For Marshall, Walras, as for Menger, analysis of the demand side of the market was critical in understanding market prices, both for consumer goods and for factors of production. Utility theory compelled the economic theorist to acknowledge the decisive role played by individual human beings, each with his or her unique set of consumer preferences, in determining the patterns of production, including both the arrays of diverse goods to be produced and the methods of production to be deployed, thus identifying the arrays of inputs to be purchased. There is little doubt, too, that when in the above-cited paragraph, Mises included the Anglo-American school and the School of Lausanne as being part of modern subjectivist economics, he was referring to that widely shared theoretical vision in economics in the early decades of the 20th century, a vision which rejected both the near-exclusive physicalism of the classical school and the historicism of the German historical school. Yet Hayek, writing in the early years of World War II, and Mises, writing and teaching at mid-century, saw the subjectivism of these marginalist revolutionaries as limited and inadequate. There was nothing in that subjectivism which was able to prevent the mid-20th century mainstream from going astray, that is, from arriving at a theoretical vision which included no scope whatever for what Hayek saw as the role for the dynamic competitive market process. That limited, inadequate subjectivism was entirely consistent with an economic theory built around a concept of so-called perfect competition, which Hayek denounced as intrinsically incapable of providing explanation for market movements. In his The Meaning of Competition, Hayek developed this critique of the perfect competition analytical framework. We have claimed a correlation between this analytical framework, the perfect competition analytical framework, and the limited subjectivism of early 20th century mainstream theorists. And at the same time, we have claimed a corresponding correlation between the deeper subjectivism of Hayek and of Mises and what Hayek viewed as a more perceptive understanding of the role of competition as a dynamic process. But in order convincingly to establish such correlation, we must explore these different levels of subjectivism more carefully. Decision-making. Closed-end framework or an open-ended framework? We may interpret Hayek and Mises' critique of mainstream neoclassical microeconomic theory in the following terms. That neoclassical theory explained market outcomes in terms of harmoniously mutually interacting decisions. Each of these decisions was seen as determined, given all the other decisions being made, determined by the decision maker's preferences and resources. Lionel Robbins' 1932 book on the economic decision being one of allocating given scarce means in order to maximize attainment of the decision maker's given ends is unquestionably, but not directly, part of our present exploration. The outcome of any such decision is implicit in the arrays of given preferences and resources, so that the market outcome, that is, the pattern assumed by all of the mutually interacting decisions, is also implicit in, utterly determined by, these given sets of individual preferences and available resources. The subjectivism respected by these mainstream microeconomic theorists, that is, their attention to the choices made by potential consumers, that's subjectivism, did not insulate them from arriving at this vision of a mutually determining, closed-ended world, a world in which ignorance, uncertainty, discovery, and inspired innovation are not permitted to introduce any cloud of less than perfect determinacy into the overall vision. Hayek's emphasis on a deeper, more encompassing level of subjectivism in economic theory enabled him to draw attention to the limitations of the earlier mainstream theorizing, built as it was on a level of subjectivist insight that was distressingly superficial. The advance of subjectivism, Hayek pointed out, focused analytical attention on the compatibility of intentions and expectations. I'm quoting from Hayek now. The compatibility of intentions and expectations of different people, of the division of knowledge between them, and the process by which relevant knowledge is acquired and expectations formed. In a footnote to this sentence, Hayek refers the reader to his 1937 paper, Economics and Knowledge. In that paper, Hayek drew attention to some of the implications of such a deeper, more advanced subjectivism. In particular, its implication for paying attention to issues concerning knowledge. He pointed out that the standard approach to theory starts from the assumption of a perfect market where every event becomes known simultaneously to every member, end of quote. He further pointed out that to start from this assumption, that is, to start from the assertion that equilibrium exists, does not get us any nearer an explanation of when and how such a state will come about. It was these very same considerations which led Hayek, in his The Meaning of Competition, to his critique of perfect competition. That notion throughout assumes that state of affairs already to exist, which according to the truer view, the process of competition tends to bring about. It was thus Hayek's rebellion against the closed-endedness of analysis, which we found to be entirely consistent with the earlier superficial and limited level of subjectivism, it was that rebellion which led him to endorse a totally different, a dynamic notion of competition. Competition, Hayek wrote, is essentially a process of the formation of opinion. By spreading information, it creates that unity and coherence of the economic system which we presuppose when we think of it as one market. We have thus succeeded, I believe, in establishing the correlation announced at the outset, the ability to transcend the flawed framework of the perfect competition equilibrium model, and thus to advance to appreciate the dynamic role of the competitive process, goes hand in hand with the advance from the closed-endedness implicit in earlier superficial subjectivism towards an appreciation of the implications of a more open-ended subjectivism, one sensitive to the role of changing knowledge and expectations and their impact on market phenomena. A brief digression may here be of some value in order to sharply distinguish the way in which Hayek introduced issues of knowledge into our understanding of the market process and its possibly equilibrative character from the way in which later neoclassical economists, such as George Stigler, introduced the economics of search into formal price theory. This latter extension of price theory recognized that market participants may find themselves in need of additional information. And this extension proceeded to incorporate the endeavors of market participants to satisfy their need for additional information through deliberate search. And they developed this into a more comprehensive price theory. Now, subjectivist economists can have no quarrel, per se, with this enrichment of standard neoclassical equilibrium price theory. However, it is necessary to point out that any such enrichment has nothing to do with a Hayekian rejection of an exclusively equilibrium, that is, perfectly competitive price theory, in favor of their subjectivist understanding of the open-ended entrepreneurial competitive process of the market, which, as we saw earlier, Hayek identified as a process of the formation of opinion. For a Stiglerian economics of search, a need for information is no different than a consumer's need for ice cream or a manufacturer's need for hired labor. One knows that one needs to consume the ice cream. One knows that one needs to hire labor. Similarly, one knows that one needs certain items of information. To search for such information is to engage in a specific kind of production. One knows what it is one wishes to produce. One knows the kinds of resources necessary successfully to produce the product. One's production decision on whether or how to search is entirely parallel to one's decision on whether or how to buy ice cream or to produce hot dogs or whatever. To research a topic in an encyclopedia is to produce information. In this framework, there are no surprises, no true discoveries. In fact, we can describe the framework within which search is conducted as a framework of perfect knowledge. Perfect knowledge, that is, of what it is that needs to be produced, together with perfect knowledge of how to produce it, perfect knowledge of the value of what one seeks to produce, and perfect knowledge of the cost of production. If ignorance persists, that ignorance is optimal. It is too costly to be worth to be removed. The sense in which Hayek understood the competitive market as one of mutual discovery is quite different. For the Hayekian discovery procedure of the competitive process, one has, up until the moment of discovery, not been aware of one's ignorance. Discovery consists in realizing the truth of matters concerning which one had previously not known that one was ignorant. The dynamic competitive market process that Hayek's subjectivism identified is one made up not by deliberate search projects, but by continually unfolding entrepreneurial conjectures concerning where profit opportunities are waiting to be grasped. We can now turn to the second of the three claims which we announced at the outset of this talk. This was the claim that it was in the meaning of competition and in the deeper level of subjectivism, which, as we've argued, was at the root of his dissatisfaction in that paper with the mainstream notion of competition. We can now discuss the claim that it was in that paper that Hayek's economic understanding came closest to that of his mentor, Ludwig Mises. Certain background clues pointing to the validity of this second claim may be noticed. We have seen how Hayek's own position in the meaning of competition flows out of his own deeper level of subjectivism. We have seen how Hayek attributed Mises' advances in economic theory to Mises' consistent application of his subjectivism. I can report that early in the 1950s, when I began my studies under Mises, he directed me to read The Meaning of Competition. He sent me to read that paper. Clearly, the message of that paper, namely the character of the dynamic competitive market process, was a message which Mises thoroughly approved of. It was a message which Hayek, too, apparently recognized to be thoroughly consistent with the deeper level of subjectivism which he associated with Mises. To recognize this convergence between Mises and Hayek is not at all to deny the differences which certainly separate Hayekian economic theory from that of Mises. Intellectual biographers of Hayek have expended much ink in their explorations of these differences and in seeking an explanation for why Hayek, at least during Mises' lifetime, failed to underline them. What concerns us in the present context is not the truth concerning the existence of these differences, an existence which we do not challenge, but the insight that despite these differences, Hayek and Mises had a basically identical understanding of the way in which a market economy works. This shared understanding, we argue, consists in their appreciation of the mutual discovery character of the dynamic market process, their appreciation for its dependency upon competition understood as continual scope for new entrepreneurial entrants into the market, and their recognition of the role of deeper subjectivist theorizing in articulating the nature of this process. Appreciation for the validity of this second claim of ours will help us understand the shared position of Mises and Hayek concerning Mises' denial of the very possibility of central economic planning under socialism. That Hayek, despite all his disagreements with Mises, fully supported Mises on this issue during the 1930s can be understood surely only in terms of the shared understanding of the market process, which permitted them to identify with precision where any centrally planned system must come up short. For a thorough analysis of how all the neoclassical so-called refutations of the Mises-Hayek position during the 1930s, how all these refutations failed to grapple with the fundamental point central to that position, namely the dynamic character of the market process, see the brilliant book-length comprehensive exposition by the late Don Lavoie. What we have argued in making our second claim is that this shared understanding of the market process is rooted in that deeper level of subjectivist understanding, which, in our first claim, we associated with Hayek's correspondingly deep appreciation for the nature of the dynamically competitive process. We should not close this section without at least recognizing, perhaps conceding is the right word, that Hayek's understanding of the dynamic market process and Mises' understanding of it, while fundamentally identical, yet came from two distinct sets of subjectivist insights. Mises' exposition did not emphasize changing arrays of knowledge and information. Rather, his exposition was rooted in his understanding of entrepreneurship. Hayek paid little, if any, attention to entrepreneurship. His exposition of the market process was in terms of changing patterns of knowledge and information. This is not the place to explore these differences between these expositions. It is my conviction, based on personal conversation with Hayek, that when pressed, Hayek was fully prepared to accept a translation of his knowledge story of the competitive process into language drawing on the role of entrepreneurship. Our second claim is thus not an attempt to paper over any differences between Misesian and Hayekian expositions of the process. It is advanced in order to emphasize the underlying commonality of the Misesian and Hayekian accounts, despite superficial differences in the wording of these respective accounts. We are now ready to turn to our third claim regarding Hayek's subjectivism and its relationship to his paper on the meaning of competition. It will be recalled that we drew attention to the circumstance that Hayek's The Meaning of Competition and his classic deep and wide discussions concerning subjectivism in the social sciences were written and published during the 1937-1948 decade. We described that decade as the decade during which, although it was hardly noticed at the time, Hayek and Mises each made decisive advances in the Austrian tradition, with these advances being able to be seen, in retrospect, as constituting pivotal events in the long-run history of the Austrian tradition and economic theory. Although we have made this third claim in prosaic, matter-of-fact language, the truth is that this claim projects an almost dramatic perspective on the Dogmen geschichtlicher events to which it refers. When I began my studies under Mises during the 1950s, the textbooks on the history of economic thought dealt with the Austrian tradition as a historical episode strictly of the past. That tradition, it was typically explained, had been an important component of the marginalist revolution of the 1870s, and it remained important during subsequent decades. It continued, moreover, at first to thrive in the interwar years, but somewhere during the 1930s, the tradition lost its important place within 20th century economics. That place came to be occupied by newer emerging schools of economic thought, including the macroeconomic thought inspired by Keynes, mathematical economics building on Walras, empirical and econometric investigations reflecting impatience with the emptiness of pure theory. The textbooks acknowledged the continuing work of Mises and of Hayek, but made it clear that their work should be seen as the last twitches of a dying tradition. In one sense, it is impossible not to concede a certain validity to these textbook treatments. The journals of that period were chock full of work stemming from the non-Austrian frameworks listed above. A student, and that's me, who confessed to studying under Mises was typically eyed with a quizzical look expressing surprise and perhaps pity. And there were grounds for believing that the Austrian tradition had been fairly vanquished on the battlefield of intellectual debate. Hayek's challenges to the macroeconomics of Keynes and his disciples seem to have been decisively quashed, Mises' thesis concerning the impossibility of central economic planning seemed to have been categorically refuted by the work of Osterlanger, Apollon, and others. Hayek's defense of Austrian capital theory, defenses built on the work of Bamberwerk, seemed to have been demolished by Frank Knight in a way that seemed to confirm the earlier anti-Bawerkian contributions of John Bates Clark. The Austrian reluctance to introduce mathematics into their theory and their abstract, non-empirical approach to issues of economic policy seemed thoroughly out of step with the rapid advances being made in mathematical economics and in econometrics. The circumstance that Austrian economics tended to support a free market ideology during a period in which the role of government in ensuring prosperity and efficiency was widely, if uncritically, accepted, must certainly have contributed to the impression that the Austrian school was, if not quite dead, as a central component of mid-century economic discussion. It was at least on its deathbed. And yet, it is our claim that precisely during the 1937-48 decade, a time during which the Austrian tradition was being given a respectful, decent burial in the textbook of the history of economic thought, the two surviving Austrians, Mises and Hayek, were making revolutionary advances in the Austrian tradition. These advances, we claim, go far to explain the remarkable rekindling of interest in the work of Mises and the Austrian tradition that we have witnessed during the last 4 decades. Precisely during the period during which the Austrian tradition was seen to have come to an end, that tradition was producing new work that would, in the fullness of time, lead to a reinvigoration, if not the resuscitation, of that tradition. The truth was that prior to the mid-30s, there was a commonly shared core of understanding among the major schools of economic theory regarding the workings of a market economy. When, as we noted earlier in this talk, Mises described the major schools of economic theory as differing only in their mode of expressing the same fundamental idea, so that these schools were divided more by their terminology and peculiarities of presentation than by the substance of their teachings, he was referring to that shared understanding of the workings of the market, as has been extensively developed in a book by Frank Machovic. This shared understanding did include an admittedly somewhat crude appreciation for a competitive process, not any preoccupation with any artificially constructed theoretical equilibrium framework of perfect competition. The shared understanding of these earlier 20th century schools of economic theory, using Machovic's words, saw the market as a process through which entrepreneurs earned profit to discover what to produce and how to produce. This shared understanding gradually came to be replaced by the mid-30s with a microeconomics dominated by the perfectly competitive model. That is, by an approach which begins with the assumption of equilibrium, with the assumption of perfect mutual information. From a perspective fully aware of the shared economic understanding of the early 20th century schools, the new microeconomics built within the equilibrium framework could be viewed in different ways. The new mainstream theorists saw this innovation as an analytical advance, replacing a loose, rather vague and crude understanding of the market process by an analytically precise, mathematically exact set of propositions which they found intellectually satisfying and pedagogically teachable. To those like Mises and Hayek, who were not prepared to surrender the older traditional shared understanding of the market, the newer analytical framework must have appeared confusingly abstract, disastrously unreal, as entirely missing the central insights of traditional economic reasoning. I have in the past suggested that what drove home to Mises and Hayek the drastic degree to which mainstream microeconomics had dumped the older verities of the profession, was the mainstream reaction to the Austrians' critique of the possibility of efficient central planning. As Mises and Hayek separately set about responding to the mainstream responses to the Austrian challenge, it apparently became clear to them how much damage the new equilibrium approach had in fact inflicted on the shared orthodoxy of the earlier neoclassicals. As they separately sought to explain what had always been meant by their thesis, that economic calculation without a competitive process was impossible, they found themselves compelled to articulate more carefully and more explicitly that which had merely been implicit in the earlier shared doctrine of the early 20th century economics. Perhaps without realizing what they were in fact doing, each of them was separately forging new complementary strands of subjectivist understanding of what is meant by the competitive market process. Mises articulated his insights in terms of the entrepreneurial character of all human action. Such an articulation decisively set his economics apart from strictly equilibrium theorizing, since in equilibrium there is no scope for entrepreneurship. Hayek deepened his understanding of the competitive process by explicitly emphasizing the necessarily subjective character of the social sciences, and was thus led to focus attention on the information communicating role of the market process. His seminal The Meaning of Competition was a key element in the brilliant set of papers in which this deeper level of subjectivism was developed. So that, in drawing attention to Hayek's recognition of different levels of subjectivism and to the relationship of that recognition to his critique of mainstream treatments of competition strictly in the sense of perfect competition, we are at the same time drawing attention to the pivotal dogmengeschichtliche significance of the 37-48 decade. This was the decade during which the Austrian school made a giant step forward through its deepening of its traditional emphasis on subjectivism. The circumstance that this was the decade during which it was thought that the Austrian tradition was no longer alive, and that no one, even Mises and Hayek, seemed to be aware of the significance of this advance, makes that advance even more intriguing and dramatic. The renewed interest in contemporary economic thought in the Austrian approach in general, and in the work of Hayek in particular, makes our third claim, that is, the claim regarding the deepening of Hayekian subjectivism during the 37-48 decade, even more relevant and noteworthy. Let me conclude. Friedrich Hayek was not merely a towering figure in 20th century economics. His extraordinary scholarship also spanned, of course, the fields of philosophy, political philosophy, legal theory, psychology, and more. His contributions to these areas have nourished and undoubtedly will continue to nourish scientific work on a vast scale. My own background as a student in the Austrian economics tradition and as a disciple of Ludwig Mises has for many decades led me more narrowly to appreciate in particular Hayek's role in the perpetuation of that Austrian tradition and his intellectual integrity in recognizing, despite the respects in which his economics differed from the Misesian, in recognizing the extent to which he and Mises had the same central understanding of the competitive market process. The dramatic circumstance that the articulation of this commonality occurred during a time when the mainstream writers saw them merely as the residual survivors of a bygone school of thought makes this even more fascinating. This evening's award from the deeply respected Hayek Society inspires me with several emotions. I am, of course, most profoundly honored by this award. I am also deeply gratified to feel that my own humble efforts over 5 decades to explore the 20th century developments in the Austrian tradition have merited the attention of this distinguished society. It is my hope that my remarks this evening on Hayek's position regarding the meaning of subjectivism express these emotions of mine in a manner which furthers not only the ideals of the Hayek Society, but also the enrichment of Hayek's scholarship and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kirzner. You, in your exposition of the two trends, you again built a bridge. And that, I think, is very valuable as something that can teach us how to deal with economic theory in the first place, but of course also with different modes of thinking in general. Thank you very much. We have a little surprise for you. Dr. Bouillon will give something to you. It's not you who sent to the back.
Yes. Well, may I read out to you, Professor Kirzner, it's with great pleasure that I present to you today the translation of your seminal economic point of view into German. As it stands, this draft will need a few rounds of revision before it can go to print. Titles need to be corrected, quotes looked up, terminology checked, the publisher decided. So in sum, there is still a lot of editorial work to be done. Being the translator, rest assured that I will do my very best to bring the project soon to a close. Anyhow, we thought today to be the right occasion for indicating to you the status quo of your upcoming book, the Ökonomische Blickwinkel. Thank you so much.